In this video, I'm going to explain how to time the effects of houses. We're used to interpreting what a house signifies, right? But we might not be so confident about saying when the effects of that house would bear fruit. That's what we're going to talk about right now. The essence of the technique is to use the transits to time the effects of the houses. So let's start with the first statement, the 31st statement of chapter 19, which is Bhavesha stitabhamsha konamapiva bhavam tuva lagnapa. Lagnesha stitabhamsha konamudayam vayati bhavadipa. Samyoge pivilokane pichayos tad bhavasiddhim tada bhuyat karaka yogatas tanupater lagnascha chandrad api. A house has effect when the first lord trines its lord, or itself, and its lord trines the first lord, or the ascendant. Sounds complicated. It's a little slightly complicated, but once you see what he means, it will be just kind of obvious. So by the time we're done with this video, this will be very, very clear exactly what he means. So just hang on for a second. Let's translate the rest of the statement. A very important term in the statement is bhamsha kona. Bha-amsha means part of a sign. So it's a kona or a trine by degree, not by signs. And it's kind of within a certain orb or range of degrees, which is something like between 5 and 8 degrees. So we're considering trines that are forming at around 5 to 8 degrees. Not necessarily that they have to actually be in trinal signs. So the first thing he said is the house will have its effect when the first lord trines its lord, or itself, and its lord trines the first lord, or the ascendant. Then he also said similar thing will happen. The house will have its effect when those two lords conjoin or have mutual aspect. Another thing that he said is the same thing can happen when the house Karaka joins the first lord, and I'll explain that as well. And finally, he said houses can be counted from the ascendant or from the moon. So we'll explain all those points by example. Let's start with this first point. The house has its effect when the first lord trines its lord or itself, and its lord trines the first lord or the ascendant. Here's a transit to my chart that illustrates this. This is from September of 2023, quite recently. In order to use this technique, what you do is you watch the transits of the first lord, the natal first lord. So in this case, we would be watching the transits of Saturn. We come across a transit in September of 2023 where Saturn is in the early degrees of Pisces, stationing actually. Now, we ask, is the first lord currently trine to anything particular in the natal chart? And when we ask that of this particular chart, we see, yes, it's trine to Jupiter at this point. The transiting Saturn is trine to the natal Jupiter, so the question is the transiting Jupiter trine to the natal Saturn or the first house? In fact, in this particular transit, it's both. The transiting Jupiter is trine to the natal Saturn by conjoining with it, and it's also trine to the ascendant. The effect comes from the houses owned by the planet that's being aspected by the first lord. So in this case, the planet being aspected by the first lord is Jupiter. And in this chart, Jupiter owns the 12th and the 3rd houses and is in the 10th. So the way you would interpret this transit is that the results of having the 12th and 3rd lord in the 10th house will come true at this particular time in September of 2023. Well, at this particular time, I published 3 books. Esoteric books on astrology or esoteric philosophy. Plus, I also traveled internationally for the first time in many years to perform. So you got all kinds of interpretations of the houses coming true at this particular time in my life. The 12th Lord in the 10th house is esoteric. The 12th Lord in the 10th house is a lot of movement and travel. The 3rd Lord in the 10th house is also movement and travel, and it's also authorship. So those particular house interpretations come true at this particular time in life. Now let's look at the second point in this statement. The same thing will happen when these two lords, the first lord and the lord of a house, conjoin, or they have mutual aspect. Here's an example transit to illustrate this, which is from December of 2020. Here we have Saturn ruling the first house, and we have Jupiter ruling the 12th and the 3rd, and they're conjoining. Now, what actually happened in December of 2020? I started my study of Phaladīpika, but no real monumental thing like publishing books or traveling internationally to perform or stuff like that. But there's a principle that he's going to bring up in text 35 that is going to directly impact how we would interpret this one. So put that on pause for a second, and we'll jump to text 35 in a minute, and then come back and look at this transit after we understand what's in text 35. Before we do that, let's just finish up with this text. He also had said that when the house Karaka joins the first lord, then you get the results of that house. So we can use the same December 2020 transit example. We have Jupiter, who's the Karaka for houses 5 and 9. What's a Karaka? A Karaka is not a lord of a house, but a planet that intrinsically represents the same sorts of things that a house represents. So Jupiter, for example, represents parenting and having children, so it represents the 9th and the 5th house. It represents wisdom and intelligence, so it represents the 9th and the 5th house. It's the Karaka for those two houses. Now, since it's joined to my first lord in this transit, then we expect to get results of the 5th and the 9th house. In addition to this, my first lord is also trine at this time to the 5th and the 9th houses. So we expect that we're going to get some significant results of the 5th and 9th. So we could say, well, I guess this study of Phaladīpika was the beginning of a serious educational pursuit, which is what you would expect from the 5th and the 9th. So here's what Mantreshwar says in Phaladīpika 1935. Lagnesha yad bhava payos to yoga, yada tada tat phala siddhi kala. Bhavesha virye shubham anyatanyat. Lagnascha chandrad api chintaniyam. Whatever a house symbolizes takes effect when its lord joins the first lord. If its lord is strong, the results are good, and vice versa. So there's the key point. If its lord is strong, then the results are good or big or strong, and then not if not. And finally, he also says in this text, consider this from the Ascendant, but also from the moon. So the key point there is if this lord is strong. Now, when we look at this transit again, is Jupiter strong? It's not weak, but it's not really strong. It's debilitated. Yet it's kind of modifying its debilitation by its association with domicile Saturn, but still it's not really terribly strong. So you do have good things come to pass for me in December of 2020, but not really fully monumental things. Now, another principle that both the 35th and the 31st texts mentioned is that you can count houses from the Ascendant. That's the primary way you count a house. But you can also count them from the moon as a secondary way. Let's take a look at that and what that means to the techniques. Let's go back to that September 2023 transit, the more recent transit where I published a lot of books. How would we read this transit from the moon, and why? Why would we do so? The reason why we would do so is because we would want to see if this particular transit that we already identified is very, very strong or just moderately strong or weak. Does it have support? Is there also some significant transit going on from the moon's point of view? If so, then this particular transit that we noticed is going to be even more significant. And we can add color and detail to the interpretation by looking at it from the moon's point of view, as a secondary, as a backup. So how would you do it? You take the moon's position natally, which is in Gemini, and you make it as though that were the Ascendant. So what you do is you rotate all the house positions relative to Gemini. Now, because Gemini is the first house relative to the moon, we're not concerned with Saturn's transits. We're concerned with the Lord of Gemini's transits, Mercury. So we want to ask, is Mercury trine to anything in this natal chart? One of the things that I'll bring out is it's trine to the natal Saturn. So then we want to ask, is the transiting Saturn also trine to Mercury or Mercury's sign, which is the first Lord Gemini, the first house from the moon? So in this case, transiting Saturn is actually trine to Gemini's cusp. So what we found is in this date of September 2023, one of the reasons why a lot of things actually happened here is because it wasn't just a significant transit from the Ascendant's point of view, it was simultaneously a significant transit from the moon's point of view. And if we apply the interpretation techniques, we would say, what houses does Saturn own? It owns the 8th and the 9th relative to the moon. Therefore, what's going to happen in September of 2023 is going to be something good about the 8th and the 9th house. That was probably something religiously spiritual or something like that. And that's why I'm publishing those types of books at this particular time of my life. Many of the techniques that Mantreshwar is talking about here can be worked out from transiting planets to natal planets. But many of them can also be worked out from transiting planets to other transiting planets. And some of them can only be worked out from transiting planets to other transiting planets. So looking at the same date, September 2023, we can look at it only with the transiting planets. And we can see that Mercury is trine to the transiting Jupiter, and Jupiter is trine to the transiting Mercury. And Mercury is important because it's the Lord of the first relative to the moon. So then we would just take these house numbers, 7 and 10, that Jupiter owns, and we would say that this is another part of what's going on at this time for this native. The 7th and the 10th house, which means interacting with people and doing business and producing things for society. Now, we've pretty well covered the techniques in statement 31 and 35. Let's go ahead and look at 32, 33, and 34, starting with 32. He says, Yad bhaveshastat arkangsha trikonaste guru yada gochare tasya bhavasya phala praptim vinirjashet. A house will have its good effects when Jupiter trines its Lord. Its good effects when Jupiter trines its Lord. Here in the Sanskrit, again, you can see it's mirroring what he said in statement 31. There he said bha-amsha kona, and here he says arkangsha trikona. So again, it means he's wanting you to look for trines by degree, within an orb of a degree, not just by whether or not things are in trinal signs to each other. So here's a transit from June of 2009. So the way that we work with this particular technique is we look at the transits of Jupiter and we ask if it's trining something in the natal chart. In this particular case, in June of 2009, Jupiter is trine to itself. So the transiting Jupiter is trine to natal Jupiter, which means that the houses owned by natal Jupiter should have good effects in June 2009. What houses are those? They're the natal houses 12 and 3. So you get more of the same thing, like spiritual things, but also the movement aspect of 12, the 12th Lord in the 10th house, the 3rd Lord in the 10th house. Especially because Jupiter is making this aspect from Aquarius, which is the native 2nd house, which has to do with family. So what happened in June of 2009 is me and my whole family relocated from America to Japan. Now let's look at the technique that Mantreshwar gives us in statement 33. Lagnari Natha Yogetu Lagnesha Durbaleripo Tada Tadvashaga Shatru Viparitam Atonyata. Enemies are subordinated when the 1st and 6th lords conjoin and the 6th is weaker than the 1st. Otherwise, the opposite happens. So this is a transit-to-transit technique. It doesn't involve the natal chart at all, except to find out and determine which planets are which lords. What you want to do is you want to look and see when will the first lord, the natal first lord, conjoin the natal sixth lord. And when they do conjoin, you have to evaluate which one is stronger. When they conjoin, then the self is meeting with the enemies. So if the enemies are stronger, then the self is defeated. And if the self is stronger, then the enemies are defeated. So if the first lord is stronger at the time of the conjunction, then the person prevails over their enemies. But if the sixth lord is stronger at the time of the conjunction, then the enemies prevail over the native. Here's an example of this at work from November of 2017. So you can see there's the tightest conjunction right here is between Saturn and Mercury. And for this native, me, Mercury is the sixth lord and Saturn is the first. So this is what he's talking about in the technique when the first and the sixth lords conjoin. So we know that I'm going to be dealing with enemies in November of 2017 and surrounding that. But the question is, who is going to prevail, me or the enemies? The way that we resolve that question is by figuring out which planet, the first or the sixth lord, is stronger. And the fact that it's not really terribly obvious which one is stronger here in this transit chart tells you about the nature of the conflict. There's not one planet who's exalted and another is debilitated or something like that. Still, it's fairly clear that Saturn at this time had a higher declension, and Saturn at this time had more Shadbala, and Saturn at this time had more dignity. So we would say at this time, I was able to overcome oppositions and enemies. What was going on at this time? This is when the whole hell was breaking loose about my defense of the use of the tropical zodiac in Vedic astrology. Now let's look at the 34th text to finish up. This technique says, Yad bhava pasya tanupasya bhavatya ritvat tat kala shatru vashatori mritistito va spardham tada vadatu ne tacha gocharasta tat vasturitvam api samyuti maitra tascha. When an enemy of the first lord is in the sixth or eighth house from it, we encounter rivalrous challenges regarding things symbolized by the houses the enemy owns. The opposite happens when friends of the first lord conjoin it. This is another transit-to-transit technique. The only thing you use the natal chart for in this technique is to figure out who are the friends and who are the enemies of the first lord. So let's do that now. In this chart, Saturn is the first lord. Saturn has one natural enemy, the sun, and one natural friend, Venus. This is about how the sun and Venus feel about Saturn. The rest of the planets feel neutral towards Saturn. But in this chart, the sun is at an ideal distance from Saturn, so the enmity dissolves into neutrality. And Venus is at a non-ideal distance from Saturn, so the friendship dissolves to neutrality. So the Sun and Venus aren't really going to play a role in this technique for this chart. But Jupiter, who's normally neutral towards Saturn, has demoted its relationship because of its extreme distance and become an enemy. So the only enemy to the first lord in this chart is Jupiter. What this technique is really saying when you resolve some of the variables specific to this natal chart. It's saying when Jupiter, the enemy of the first lord, is 6 or 8 signs from Saturn, the first lord, then the circumstances in the native's life are going to try to steal things from the native. What kind of things? Things related to the houses that the enemy owns. So things related to the houses that Jupiter owns at the time of the transit. Let me show you how this looks in a real transit. This is October of 1991. We don't need to see the natal chart. We just need to know that Jupiter is the enemy of the first lord, Saturn. And we arrange the houses relative to the first lord's position at the time. So we're counting Aquarius as the first house. And we see Jupiter at this time is 8 houses away from Saturn. It's 8 signs away from Saturn. So you got this condition in the transits where the enemy of the first lord is in an enemy spot to the first lord. So the person is going to have to deal with problems, difficulties, challenges. Since Jupiter owns Sagittarius and Pisces, those are the 2nd and 11th houses relative to Aquarius where the first lord is at the time. So what's going to happen is this person is going to deal with things that are trying to strip them of what the 2nd and 11th represents. What happened in October of 1991? I joined a cult. I joined ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement. So what did that do to all my friendships and my family relationships? What to speak of my wealth? Why such a significant effect from this transit? One reason may be that it is sort of mirrored in the natal chart. Jupiter, the enemy of Saturn, is in an enemy's position relative to Saturn. So that's all for this section of Phaladīpika, which is all about how to interpret the timing of the effects of houses by using transits. I hope you liked it. Subscribe, because I do Phaladīpika serially. Every week or so, I give the next section. So please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much.